So this is the third of our messages in this series called Pressure Points. We're talking about some of our deepest human needs and how the gospel of Jesus directly speaks to those needs. So far we've talked about the fear of death, and we've talked about the burden of shame. And if you've missed either of those messages, you can visit our website or our YouTube channel and check those out and catch up. But today, you see, we're going to talk about the search for truth. Since the beginning of time, human beings have been searching for truth, asking fundamental questions like these. Who am I? How did I get here? Where am I going? What's the meaning or purpose of life? And no one, I think, has summed up those kind of thoughts more succinctly than Pontius Pilate. You heard in John 18 at the trial of Jesus, Jesus says, "Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." And Pilate responds with those three powerful words. What is truth? And I suspect that Pilate was really not being inquisitive so much as he was being dismissive. It was not, what is truth? It was, what is truth? But regardless of what he meant, Pilate articulated in those three words one of the most fundamental questions of human existence. We all ask at some point or another and want to know, what is truth? Earlier in John 8, Jesus explains why this question is so important. It's not important simply because lies are morally wrong and truth is morally right. It's even more important than that. Jesus says truth brings freedom. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. We like to say sometimes the truth hurts, and that's true, but even when it does, the truth is vitally important, because even truth that hurts sets us free. A few weeks ago, I had a serious problem at my house. I heard a toilet running one day, and so I bent over and turned the water off to the toilet so I could fix it, and the water kept running. Now, I am no plumbing expert, but even I knew that's not good. And so I called a friend of mine, who in turn called his plumber friend, who in turn called leak specialists that he knew, and they ended up finding a pinhole leak in one of the pipes under our house. And so they had to come in and tear up our floor and jackhammer through the concrete and make a real mess. And a very expensive mess also. But even so, I am glad that they told me the truth. What if they had found the leak and they had thought to themselves, you know what, this guy's not going to like this. He's not going to like when he finds out how much this is going to cost him to fix this. So how about if we just tell him there's no problem and get out of here? I might have been happier for a little while, but I wouldn't have been free from my problems, would I? In fact, it would only cause bigger and messier and more expensive problems down the road. No matter how hard it was to hear, I wanted to know the truth. Or what about a friend of mine last week who was waiting for the result of a medical test? He's a cancer survivor, and so every few months he has to go in and get some tests done to see if his cancer has returned. And a few very anxious days went by after the test, and then the doctors called with the good news. His tests looked good. No cancer. That was wonderful news. It was freeing news. But it was only freeing because it was true. Right? If the doctor had been incompetent or had missed cancer that was actually there, or if he had found cancer but just didn't want to be the bearer of bad news to my friend and lied to my friend about it, my friend would have been just as happy. but he wouldn't have been free. Because in the medical world, not knowing the truth can be a death sentence. My friend needed to know the truth. See, Jesus is absolutely right. Freedom is not automatic. Freedom is conditional. Only if you know the truth will you be set free. And then in another famous passage that we didn't read, John 14, I think many of you will know it though, Jesus makes an even more profound and radical statement. Do you remember these words? He says this there, I am the truth. Not just I know the truth or I speak the truth. No, I am it. And notice it's not even just I am truth, it's I am the truth. Jesus is telling us he is the ultimate source of truth. And that means that we can only know the fullness of truth if we know him. Freedom is conditional, but it's not just conditional on one thing, but on two. It's not just if you know the truth will set you free. No, he says, if you continue in my word, then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Man's search for truth begins and ends with Jesus, because he doesn't just know the truth, he is the truth. So let's consider this morning how Jesus helps us know the truth about those four big questions we posed at the beginning. First, this one, who am I? Now, if you want to try to answer that question, you don't actually need to go to Jesus. You can just look it up on the source of all knowledge, the World Wide Web, right? And so that's what I did. And here's what I found out about who you are, according to the source of truth, Wikipedia, right? There it is. That's who you are. You are 3% nitrogen, 10% hydrogen, 18% carbon, 65% oxygen, and the other 4% is other stuff like Twinkies and Oreos and things like that. Now that's not wrong, right? That is who you are. But if you think that's all you are, then no wonder you live in hopelessness and despair. Jesus tells you the truth that you are much, much more than just that. In fact, in that other reading, John 14, where he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, he also says this. He says, in my Father's house are many rooms. You heard this in the song we just sang. I am going there to prepare a place for you. It's very important. Think about that. There's a place for you in the Father's house. There's no place for you in my house. No offense. Why? Because you're not part of my family. I can make a place for you. Sometimes I do that sort of thing. But no matter how long my guests stay, there'll always only be guests. There's not really long-term a place for them. They don't belong there. But Jesus says there's a place for you in his Father's house. And that means you're part of the family. You're a child of the Most High God. You are not just a mass of chemicals. You are someone that God the Father calls his own, and that Jesus calls his brother. That's the truth about who you are. But of course, you could never know that unless you know Jesus. Now, what about our second question? How did we get here? Well, again, if you search the internet for an answer to that question, you might drum up some images like this one. Is that how you got here? Well, here's the thing. Even if you believe that that's true, that's what happened, it's still not the whole truth that you need to know. Because Jesus tells you today in John 18 this, my kingdom is not of this world. My kingdom is of another place. Jesus says we need to understand that while he was born in the manger of Bethlehem, he did not come into existence at the manger of Bethlehem. Because he's part of another kingdom, an eternal kingdom. Jesus has existed forever. And if that's true, then that means that our origin story doesn't start at our birth either. It starts with the mind of God, who before we were ever born conceived us and knit us together in our mother's womb. As Psalm 139 says, all the days ordained for me were written in your book, God, before one of them came to be. That's where you came from. You came from God, and you were made for God. That's the truth. I love how C.S. Lewis describes this in his very classic book, Mere Christianity. Here's what he has to say. I love this quote. The Christian says, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger. Well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. That's the truth. You got here not simply through a process of chance and coincidence, but because Almighty God made you. And he made you for another world, not just for this one. Which leads us to our third question. Third question is, where are we going? Right? What is all this human experience leading to? Anything? Is there a destination at the end of all this? Well, without Jesus, human beings have to say that we are actually going nowhere. That when you die, and that's it. That's the end. And so the best we can do is just try to make the most of this life while we can. And what a hopeless existence that is, if you think that way. That's the kind of thinking that led the writer of Ecclesiastes to look at his life and say, meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. He was right without Jesus. But Jesus tells us the truth. He tells us that this life is not all that there is. Death is not the end. Life has a destination, not an end. He says in John 14, where he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He says, in my Father's house are many rooms. I'm going there to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. And of course, the reason that that's so important is because the way you think about your future will directly impact how you live today. Right? If you think that this life is all that there is, then there's no accountability for wrong behavior so long as you can get away with it. If you die and that's it, then what motivation do you have for loving and serving your neighbor? The heck with your neighbor. Do whatever you want. But if someday soon we all have to stand before God and give an account of our lives, then everything we do matters. Even the stuff we can hide from everybody else. If God is the author of all things, then everything we have is only a gift from Him, and we have to live our lives as stewards and not owners. Because we know we don't really own anything. Everything belongs to God and comes from God. And all of this then leads us to our fourth and final question: what's the purpose of life? And Jesus, we find, summed up His purpose pretty well in John 18:37. He says to us, "For this reason I came into the world, to testify to the truth." And brothers and sisters in Christ, if we follow Him, then that's got to be our purpose also. Our purpose is not simply to amass as much stuff as we can and have as much fun as we are able before we die. Christians are not supposed to live simply for their own pleasure. We live to do what He did, to testify to the truth. Because we know the truth is that only Jesus can answer those critical questions. Who am I? You're a child of the Most High God. Where did I come from? You're a part of a kingdom that is not of this world. Where am I going? Jesus is coming back to take you to be where He is now. What's the meaning and purpose of life? To testify to the truth. To tell people that the one who is the way and the truth and the life is the truth that will set you free. Let's bow our heads and pray.